In the sun-baked expanse of Arizona Territory, 1878, legends don't always wear their reputations openly. Sometimes they're buried deep, like precious water beneath desert sand, only surfacing when circumstances demand. They say the most dangerous wolves are the ones that walk quietly among the sheep, and in the dusty streets of Salvation Creek, that old saying was about to prove truer than anyone could have imagined. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. Salvation Creek barely deserved its name in the spring of 1878. Nestled in a forgotten corner of Arizona Territory, it was little more than a cluster of weather-beaten buildings clinging to life along the banks of a temperamental creek. The town's heartbeat in its modest establishments, Mason's General Store, the weather-worn Crown and Saddle Saloon, a small church whose white paint had long since surrendered to the elements, and a scatter of determined homesteads stretching out into the surrounding valley. Sarah Mason had run the general store since her husband's passing 5 years prior, and she'd learned to read more than just account books in that time. She'd learned to read people, to see the stories written in their eyes and the way they carried themselves. That's why the stranger who walked into her store one crisp March morning caught her attention in a way few others had. He led a well-loaded mule, its packs filled with farming implements and seed bags. Nothing unusual there. Plenty of hopeful farmers had passed through Salvation Creek, though few stayed long enough to see their crops grow. But there was something about this one that made Sarah's carefully honed instincts stir. He wasn't particularly tall or imposing, dressed in simple clothes that had seen honest wear. His face was the kind that could vanish in any crowd, forgettable in its ordinariness. Yet Sarah noticed how his eyes swept the store in one quick glance, marking every exit, every possible position of advantage. Those weren't a farmer's eyes. She'd seen eyes like that before, back when her brother rode with the Arizona Rangers. "Name's Daniel Morgan," he said, voice soft as wind through prairie grass. "Looking to buy some supplies." His hands moved with unusual grace as he selected basic farming necessities, each motion precise, controlled. These weren't just a farmer's hands, despite the fresh calluses she could see forming on them. "Planning to stay long?" Sarah asked. Measuring out coffee beans with practiced care, the valley had seen its share of drifters, each bringing their own brand of trouble. "Bought the old Henderson place," Morgan replied, referring to a plot of land east of town that most considered too close to Apache territory to farm safely. "The soil looks good. The water's deep but reachable." Sarah watched him count out silver dollars with those two graceful hands. "Henderson's left because of the raids," she said carefully. "Apache war parties aren't the only trouble out that way." Morgan's smile didn't quite reach his eyes. "Trouble has a way of finding everyone, Mrs. Mason. The question is whether you're ready when it comes." Young Tommy Mason, Sarah's 11-year-old son, had been watching the exchange with keen interest. Something about the stranger had captured his attention, the way he moved, perhaps, or how he seemed to know exactly where everyone in the store was without looking directly at them. "Need help carrying anything to your mule, mister?" Tommy offered, eager to learn more about the mysterious newcomer. "Appreciate the offer, son," Morgan replied, "but I prefer to manage my own loads." He paused, studying the boy with those two sharp eyes. "Though if you're interested in learning something useful, I could use help marking out proper rows once I get my field cleared." "Your mother, of course." Sarah hesitated. Her motherly instincts warned her about letting Tommy get too close to a stranger with such carefully hidden depths, but something in Morgan's manner, the gentle way he spoke to her son while still showing proper deference to her authority, made her reconsider. "We'll see," she said finally. "Once you're settled in." Morgan tipped his hat and left, leading his laden mule toward the eastern edge of town. Sarah watched him go, noting how he automatically kept the setting sun at his back, another small detail that seemed out of place for a simple farmer. The next few weeks saw Daniel Morgan working his chosen plot of land with methodical precision. From dawn until dusk, he could be found clearing rocks, measuring rows with unusual exactness, and setting fence posts with the careful attention of a man marking distances for something far more important than farming. Tommy, despite his mother's initial reservations, had taken to watching Morgan work from the hills above the farm. The boy's sharp eyes noticed things others might miss. How Morgan would sometimes pause in his labor, head cocked slightly, as though listening for something beyond normal hearing, or how his hands would occasionally drift to his right hip where no gun hung, moving with a fluid grace that seemed at odds with his farmer's tasks. What truly caught Tommy's attention, though, was what happened one morning when he'd crept closer than usual to watch Morgan clear rocks from a future field. A diamondback rattler, disturbed by the work, struck out from beneath a sun-warmed stone. Morgan's reaction defied belief. Without seeming to look, without even changing expression, his hand flicked out with impossible speed. The snake fell dead, its head nearly severed by a thrown piece of fencing staple. It was the kind of move that shouldn't have been possible, too fast, too precise, like his hand knew where it needed to be before his mind gave the command. Tommy scurried home that day, his young mind racing with questions about the mysterious farmer who moved like no farmer he'd ever seen. But Salvation Creek held deeper secrets than just the identity of one unusual farmer. The water that gave the town its lifeline wasn't just good. It was salvation in a territory where drought could spell death. Natural springs fed the creek year-round, making it a prize worth fighting for, and fighting they would. The Box Canyon Raiders had started their push north through the territory, led by the infamous Lucas Deadeye Thorne. They'd begun small, just another gang of outlaws, hitting stagecoaches and isolated ranches. But Thorne was smarter than most, realizing that true power in the desert lay not in gold or silver, but in controlling the water itself. He'd already seized 2 valleys to the south, using a combination of terror and ruthless efficiency to force ranchers to sell their water rights for pennies on the dollar. Those who refused tended to have tragic accidents, fires that started in the dead of night, cattle found poisoned at their water holes, or worse. The Mason family knew Thorne's methods all too well. Sarah's younger brother Michael had been deputy, a sheriff in Promise Wells, when the Raiders first began their expansion. He'd tried to organize resistance, unite the local ranchers against Thorne's pressure. They found him one morning behind his own jail, shot through both hands before the killing. Shot, his deputy's badge replaced with a crude metal box, Thorne's calling card. As spring deepened into summer, word of the Raiders' approach spread through Salvation Creek like wildfire in dry grass. Most folks paid little mind to Daniel Morgan during these tense days. He was just another farmer coaxing life from stubborn earth, no different from the others who worked the valley's scattered plots. But Sarah Mason, watching from her store window as Morgan purchased supplies with those 2 graceful hands, noticed how his eyes tracked every rider who passed through town, how he seemed to be measuring more than just the distance between crop rows as he worked his fields. And young Tommy, still watching from his hidden perches, saw how Morgan's farmers' routine masked something far more purposeful, like a man preparing ground for a harvest that had nothing to do with crops. Sheriff William Hayes watched these developments from his office with growing concern, the weight of his badge becoming heavier with each passing day. He was a good man, folks said, honest and determined to do right by his town. But good intentions weren't always enough against the kind of evil riding toward their valley, and he knew it better than most. One evening, as the sun painted the western sky in shades of blood and gold, Hayes found Morgan repairing a broken fence line on his property. He'd been meaning to have a word with the mysterious farmer, particularly after hearing Tommy Mason's wild tales about the rattlesnake incident. "Mighty precise work you do, Mr. Morgan," Hayes commented, watching how the farmer's hands moved with fluid efficiency. "Don't believe I've ever seen fence posts set quite so carefully." Morgan didn't look up from his work, but something in his posture shifted slightly. "Good fences make good neighbors, Sheriff. Man ought to be precise about where he draws his lines." Hayes shifted in his saddle, choosing his next words carefully. "Been hearing interesting stories about you. The boy says he saw you kill a rattler with a fence staple. That's quite a trick." "Tommy has quite an imagination," Morgan replied mildly, but his hands had stilled on the fence wire, "though sometimes a snake needs dealing with." "Indeed it does," Hayes agreed, "just like sometimes a man needs to know who's really settling in his town, particularly with trouble riding up from the south." This time Morgan did look up, and Hayes felt the full weight of those measuring eyes. "Seems to me, Sheriff, that a man's past is his own business as long as he tends his crops and pays his taxes." "Under normal circumstances, I'd agree. But with Deadeye Thorn pushing north, circumstances are far from normal." Hayes paused, then added quietly, "I knew a man once, during my time with the territorial marshals. They called him the Desert Ghost, fastest draw I ever saw. But it wasn't just his speed that made him dangerous. It was how he thought, how he planned. Never did learn his real name." Morgan had returned to his fence work, his movements as precise as ever. "Interesting story, Sheriff, but I'm just a farmer trying to make something grow in difficult ground." "Course you are," Hayes said, turning his horse to leave. "Just like I'm just a simple lawman trying to protect his town. But if you were something more, say a man who might understand what we're really up against, I'd sleep better knowing. You were here. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story." As Hayes rode away, he didn't look back. If he had, he might have seen how Morgan tested the tension in his fence wire with the same careful attention a gunfighter might use to check the action of his revolver. The next morning, more rumors arrived with the stage from Promise Wells. The Box Canyon Raiders had taken another valley, this time without firing a shot. They'd poisoned the wells first, waited until the ranchers were desperate, then offered to buy them out for a fraction of their worth. Those who refused had their homes burned, their livestock scattered. Deadeye Thorn was learning that fear could be an even more effective weapon than violence. Sarah Mason was counting inventory when Morgan came in for his weekly supplies. She noticed his list had changed. Less seed and farming implements, more rope, wire, and oddly specific amounts of mining supplies. "Planning on doing some blasting?" she asked casually, wrapping his purchases. "Lot of rocks still in that field of yours?" "Something like that," Morgan replied, but his eyes were focused on the street outside, where a group of rough-looking riders had just tied up at the Crown and Saddle. Though sometimes the best way to move a boulder isn't to break it, but to make it roll where you want it to go. Tommy, sweeping the store's porch, burst in with excitement. "Mr. Morgan, they're saying Deadeye Thorn himself was spotted in Stone Pass. They say he can shoot a man's gun right out of his holster at 50 paces. Morgan's reaction was subtle, just a slight tightening around his eyes, but Sarah caught it. "That's so," he said mildly. "Impressive trick. Of course, shooting a man's gun isn't the same as outthinking him. Remember that, Tommy." Sarah waited until her son had returned to his sweeping before speaking quietly. "You're preparing for something, aren't you? All these supplies, the way you've set up your farm, it's not just for crops." Morgan studied her for a long moment, those sharp eyes seeming to measure not just her words, but her character. "Mrs. Mason, in my experience, the best preparation isn't about stockpiling weapons or building fortifications. It's about understanding the ground you're standing on, knowing every advantage it offers, and being patient enough to let your opponent make the first mistake." "And what mistake do you think Deadeye Thorn will make?" Morgan's smile was ghost quiet. "The same one men like him always make, thinking that fear is stronger than community. that terror can break bonds built on trust and mutual support. He gathered his supplies with those two graceful hands. They're about to learn differently. Salvation Creek was about to learn that sometimes the deadliest force isn't the thunder of many guns, but the lightning of one man's draw. And Daniel Morgan, the quiet farmer with two graceful hands, was quietly preparing to teach that lesson to anyone who mistook his patience for weakness. The first real sign of trouble came to Salvation Creek on a Tuesday morning, riding in with the dawn. 3 men, dusty from the trail but wearing clothes too fine for common drifters, walked into Mason's general store just as Sarah was opening up. Their gun belts were tied low, Mexican style, and their eyes held the cold calculation of men measuring everything in terms of profit and pain. "Fine establishment you have here, ma'am," the leader said, his voice carrying a false sweetness that set Sarah's nerves on edge. "Name's James Cooper. My associates and I represent certain business interests looking to invest in promising locations." Sarah continued arranging her shelves, keeping her movements calm despite the tension building in her store. "Salvation Creek's just a small farming town, Mr. Cooper. Not much here to interest outside investors." Cooper's smile didn't reach his eyes. "Oh, I wouldn't say that. Good water's worth more than gold these days. Speaking of which, we heard you might know something about local water rights, being a prominent business owner and all." Before Sarah could respond, the store's bell chimed. Daniel Morgan walked in, leading his mule for his regular supply run. He moved with that same quiet grace, seemingly absorbed in his own thoughts. But Sarah noticed how he positioned himself. With clear sight lines to all 3 strangers, Cooper's hand drifted casually closer to his gun. "Don't believe we've met, friend. Just having a friendly conversation about local business opportunities." "Daniel Morgan," came the soft reply. "Just a farmer trying to make things grow." He began selecting his supplies with unhurried precision, but Sarah saw how his movements kept him in perfect position to react if needed. "Farmer, eh?" Cooper's voice held thinly veiled contempt. "Must be tough working land out here, especially with all the accidents that seem to happen to folks who don't understand the changing times." Morgan paused in his shopping, studying a packet of seed with careful attention. "Funny thing about accidents," he said mildly. "They tend to happen most often to people who aren't paying proper attention to their surroundings." The threat, subtle as a whisper but sharp as a knife's edge, hung in the air. Cooper's face darkened, but before he could respond, Sheriff Hayes appeared in the doorway, his badge catching the morning light. "Gentlemen," Hayes said carefully, "I wouldn't want any accidents in Mrs. Mason's store. Bad for business, you understand." Cooper forced his smile back into place. "Of course, Sheriff. Just having a friendly chat about local opportunities. In fact, we were just leaving." He tipped his hat to Sarah with exaggerated courtesy. "We'll be seeing you again, ma'am. Count on it." After they left, Hayes turned to Morgan. "Those were Thorne's men, scouts, testing our defenses, measuring our resolve." "Figured as much," Morgan replied, continuing his shopping with the same careful precision. "They'll be back, probably within the week. Next time with a proper offer, backed by proper threats." Sarah's hands trembled slightly as she wrapped Morgan's purchases. "They're going to try to force us to sell, aren't they? Just like in Promise Wells, most likely." Morgan's voice remained calm, but there was steel beneath the softness. "But there's something they don't understand about this valley. Something that makes it different from the others they've taken." "And what's that?" Hayes asked. Morgan's smile was ghost quiet. "They're used to dealing with scattered homesteads, isolated ranches, easy to pick off one by one. But a community that stands together, that's something else entirely." That evening, Hayes called a town meeting in the church. The weathered pews filled quickly. Ranchers from the outlying farms, shopkeepers, even a few Apache traders who'd become regular visitors to the creek. Morgan stood at the back, watching everything with those two sharp eyes. "You all know why we're here," Hayes began, his voice carrying to every corner of the small building. "The Box Canyon Raiders are moving north and we're next on their list. They've already started their usual pattern. Scouts making threats dressed up as business opportunities. Strange accidents happening to those who don't cooperate." Old man Jenkins, who ran the livery stable, spoke up. "We heard what happened in Promise Wells. They poisoned the wells, burned out anyone who resisted. How are we supposed to fight something like that? By being smarter than they are." Morgan's quiet voice cut through the murmurs of fear. All eyes turned to him as he stepped forward. "They expect us to either fight them head-on and lose, or give, interfere and sell out. But there's a third option. And what's that?" someone called out. "We prepare, not just with guns and barricades, but with something they won't expect." Morgan moved to the front of the church, and Sarah noticed how everyone seemed to lean forward, drawn by the quiet authority in his voice. "They think they understand this valley because they've seen a map, but they don't know its heart, its hidden strengths. We can use that." Tommy, sitting beside his mother, watched in fascination as Morgan began to outline his plan. It wasn't just about defense. It was about using the valley itself as a weapon, turning the raiders' own tactics against them. "The creek doesn't just flow where you see it," Morgan explained, drawing a rough map on the church's blackboard. "There are underground springs, hidden watercourses. We can use those, create false trails, make them think the water's somewhere. It's not. But for this to work, everyone has to play their part." Over the next hour, Morgan laid out a strategy that made Sarah realize just how much attention he'd been paying to every detail of the valley. He knew every hidden cave, every natural choke point, every place where the terrain could be used to channel movement or create confusion. "Mr. Morgan," Hayes said finally, "you seem to know an awful lot about tactical planning for a farmer." Morgan's smile didn't quite reach his eyes. "Let's just say I've had experience dealing with men like Thorne. They're predictable in their own way, always looking for the quickest path to power, never stopping to consider that sometimes the strongest position isn't the highest ground, but the most carefully prepared." As the meeting broke up, Sarah noticed how the atmosphere had changed. Where there had been fear, now there was purpose. Where there had been resignation, now there was resolve. Morgan had given them something more valuable than just a plan. He'd given them hope. But hope, as they were about to learn, could be a dangerous thing in the wrong hands. As the town dispersed to begin their preparations, none of them noticed the figure slipping away into the darkness. One of Thorne's men, who had listened to every word. The next morning brought news that changed everything. Deadeye Thorne himself had been spotted less than 2 days' ride away, leading a force of at least 30 hardened gunmen. But more troubling was what young Tommy discovered while checking Morgan's farm. "The springs!" He burst into the store, breathing hard from running. "Someone's poisoned the hidden springs near Mr. Morgan's farm, and there's tracks leading south. They know about the underground watercourses." Sarah's heart sank. Their secret advantage was compromised before they could even implement Morgan's plan. But when she rode out to tell him, she found Morgan calmly tending his crops, that same ghost of a smile playing around his lips. "Worried about the poisoned springs, Mrs. Mason?" he asked, not looking up from his work. "They know our plans," she said. "They were listening last night." "Of course they were." Morgan's hands moved with practiced precision as he checked his plants. "Told you exactly what I wanted them to hear, showed them exactly what I wanted them to see. Sometimes, Mrs. Mason, the best trap isn't the one you set. It's the one your enemy thinks they've discovered on their own." Sarah studied him with new understanding. "You wanted them to find those springs." Morgan nodded. While they're focused on what they think is our water supply, they won't be looking for the real sources. And when they try to use that knowledge against us—" his smile broadened slightly. "Well, let's just say Deadeye Thorn is about to learn that sometimes the fastest draw isn't the one that wins the fight." Sarah watched Morgan work for a moment longer, noticing how his movements seemed to carry more purpose now, as if the approaching conflict had awakened something in him that farming had kept dormant. "There's something else you're not telling." "Isn't there?" she asked. "About why you really came here, why you chose this valley?" Morgan straightened, brushing dirt from his hands with deliberate care. "When I was younger," he said slowly, "I learned that the most dangerous weapon isn't always the fastest gun or the biggest army. Sometimes it's patience, the willingness to plant seeds and wait for them to grow." He gestured at his carefully tended fields where the crops grew in patterns that seemed random, but Sarah now realized had been precisely planned. Every furrow, every fence post, every structure on this farm was positioned for a purpose beyond farming. Been preparing. "This ground since the day I arrived, knowing what was coming. You knew about Thorn, about the raiders?" "Been following their pattern for months," Morgan admitted. "Valley to valley, always the same approach. But this time—" He looked out across his land, where the evening sun painted long shadows that seemed to hold secrets. "This time they're riding into something they don't understand." The conversation was interrupted by the arrival of Sheriff Hayes, riding hard from town. "Morgan!" One of Thorne's men was spotted leaving Dawson's ranch. The old man's dead, shot through both hands before they finished him. Morgan's reaction was subtle but clear. A stillness came over him, the kind that Sarah had seen in mountain lions just before they pounced. "Thorne's sending a message," he said quietly, "trying to break our resolve before he arrives in force." "That's not all," Hayes continued grimly. "They say his brother Seth is riding with him this time. The Snake Charmer, they call him. Some claim he's even faster with a gun than Deadeye himself." A ghost of a smile touched Morgan's lips. "Is that so?" His hand drifted unconsciously to his right side, where Sarah noticed for the first time the slight wear in his shirt fabric, the kind that might come from a holstered gun, rubbing against cloth. "Been a while since I heard that name." "You know him?" Hayes asked sharply. "Let's just say we've met down in Mexico a few years back. He's fast, right enough, but speed isn't everything in a fight. Sometimes the slowest hand is the one that wins, long as it moves at the right moment." Tommy, who had been listening from nearby, couldn't contain his curiosity any longer. "Mr. Morgan, are you really just a farmer? The way you move sometimes, the way you talk about fighting—" Morgan knelt down to the boy's level, his voice gentle but serious. "Tommy, let me tell you something important. A man's not just one thing. Maybe I learned some skills in my younger days that weren't about farming, but what matters isn't what a man can do with a gun. It's what he chooses to do with his knowledge, his experience." He stood, addressing both Hayes and Sarah now. "The raiders think they're riding into another easy victory. They expect to find scared farmers and shopkeepers ready to break at the first sign of violence. Instead, they're going to learn that sometimes the strongest weapon isn't the gun in your hand, but the ground beneath your feet and the people standing beside you." As the sun set over Salvation Creek, the distant sound of hoofbeats carried across. The valley, the Box Canyon Raiders were coming, but they weren't riding toward the weak, isolated town they expected. Under the quiet guidance of a farmer with two graceful hands, Salvation Creek had become something else entirely. A trap waiting to be sprung, and a lesson waiting to be taught about the true meaning of strength. And Daniel Morgan, watching the approaching dust cloud with those two sharp eyes, knew that the time had come to show Deadeye Thorn and his raiders that sometimes the deadliest force isn't the fastest gun, but the most patient one. The seeds he had planted in this valley were about to bear fruit, though not the kind that grows in ordinary soil. These seeds would bloom in gunsmoke and justice, and their harvest would change more than just one small town in the Arizona Territory. Deadeye Thorne rode into Salvation Creek at high noon, timing his arrival for maximum effect. He cut an impressive figure astride his coal-black stallion, his signature double gun belts worn crossed in an X across his chest. 30 riders flanked him, hard men with cold eyes and well-worn weapons. But it was his brother Seth, the snake charmer, who drew the most attention. Seth Thorne rode slightly behind his brother, his right hand wrapped in a black leather glove, despite the desert heat. A silver snake pin glinted on his vest, and his gun belt was worn high and tight in the Mexican style. His eyes constantly scanned the seemingly empty street, as if searching for something and or someone among the shuttered buildings. The town appeared deserted at first glance, though keen observers might have noticed subtle movements behind windows, shadows shifting in unusual ways. Morgan's preparations had transformed Salvation Creek in ways that weren't immediately visible to the untrained eye. "Quite the welcome," Deadeye called out, his voice carrying across the empty street. "You'd think folks had never seen honest businessmen coming to invest in their community." The laugh that followed held no warmth, like wind through a boneyard. Sheriff Hayes emerged from his office, badge gleaming but his hands carefully away from his gun. "Mr. Thorne," he said evenly, "we weren't expecting such a large business delegation." "Best kind of negotiation," Thorne smiled, showing teeth that seemed too sharp. "Helps keep things civil. Speaking of which, I hear you've got some of the finest water rights in the territory. Shame if they were being wasted on folks who don't have the resources to make the most of them." The exchange was interrupted by the sound of wagon wheels. Daniel Morgan drove his mule-drawn cart down the main street, seemingly oblivious to the tension. He guided his wagon through the crowd of mounted men with careful precision, nodding politely to those he passed. Deadeye's attention snapped to the newcomer like a hawk spotting movement. "Don't believe we've had the pleasure," he called out. "Lucas Thorne, at your service. My associates and I are looking to invest in local water rights, build something special here in Salvation Creek." Morgan secured his mule before turning, his movements unhurried. "Daniel Morgan," he replied simply, "just a farmer trying to grow something worthwhile." But Seth Thorne had gone rigid in his saddle, his gloved hand tightening on his reins. "Brother," he said softly, his voice carrying an edge of both fear and recognition, "this is no farmer." Deadeye's eyes narrowed. "Something you want to share, Seth?" "That stance." Seth's voice had dropped to barely above a whisper. "The way he moves, I've seen it before, down in Sonora." His gloved hand flexed unconsciously. "They called him the Desert Ghost." A murmur ran through the raiders' ranks. Even Deadeye seemed taken aback, though he quickly masked it with a sneer. "Ghost stories, brother. This here's just a simple dirt farmer. Isn't that right, Mr. Morgan?" Morgan had begun unloading supplies from his wagon, his movements as precise and measured as ever. "Interesting thing about ghosts, Mr. Thorne," he said mildly. "They tend to appear when something needs setting right, when balance needs restoring." Balance? Deadeye's hand drifted closer to his gun. "The only balance that matters is between those with power and those without. The way I hear it, your crops aren't doing so well since those springs got poisoned. Mighty shame that. Of course, I might be willing to take that worthless land off your hands. Fair price considering." Morgan continued his work, but Sarah, watching from her store window, saw how his hands had stilled slightly, like a rattler, about to strike. "Funny thing about poison," he said quietly. "Man ought to be careful where he puts it. Might find it flowing back in unexpected directions." Before Thorne could respond, a commotion erupted from the south end of town. One of his scouts came riding in hard, his horse lathered and breathing heavy. He dismounted in a rush, whispering urgently in Deadeye's ear. Whatever news he brought caused the raider leader's face to darken like a thunderhead. We'll continue this discussion later, Thorne said, his casual tone belied by the tension in his shoulders. He turned to Hayes. Sheriff, you might want to ride out to the South Springs. Seems there's been another unfortunate accident. After the raiders rode south, Sarah hurried to where Morgan stood calmly arranging his supplies. Those weren't just threats, she said quietly. They're really going to try to poison our water, aren't they? Already have, Morgan replied, his voice carrying that same steady calm. Or at least they think they have. Remember what I said about showing them exactly what I wanted them to see? Understanding dawned in Sarah's eyes. The springs they poisoned aren't the ones that really feed the creek. Morgan's smile held a predator's satisfaction. Been watching them for days, letting them think they found our secret water sources. Meanwhile, the real springs are untouched, protected in ways they haven't even thought to look for. Tommy, who had been listening nearby, couldn't contain his excitement. Is it true what Seth Thorne said? Are you really the desert ghost? Morgan's face grew serious. Names don't matter much, son. What matters is what a man does with whatever skills he has. Sometimes the best way to be a ghost isn't to haunt people, but to protect them. Sheriff Hayes approached, his expression grim. They're setting up camp just south of town. At least 30 men, well armed, looking like they're planning to stay a while. He paused, then added, If you really are who Seth Thorne thinks you, now might be a good time to tell us what we're really dealing with. Morgan studied the sheriff for a long moment, then nodded slightly. 3 years ago in Sonora, Seth Thorne and his men were terrorizing mining towns, using the same tactics they're using here. Poisoned wells, burned homes, forcing people to sell everything they had, until someone stopped them. The desert ghost, Tommy breathed. A man who'd learned that sometimes the fastest way to stop evil isn't to outshoot it, but to outthink it. Morgan's hand drifted unconsciously to his side. Seth lost the use of 2 fingers that day, along with his taste for fair fights, started sending others to do his killing for him. His brother Deadeye took up the slack, built their operation into what you see now. And now they're here, Sarah said quietly. They're here because this valley is the key to controlling water rights all through the territory. Take Salvation Creek. They control everything from here to the border. Morgan's eyes took on that distant look that meant he was seeing more than just the immediate scene. But they don't understand what they're really riding into. What do you mean? Hayes asked. Look around you. Morgan gestured at the town, at his carefully prepared farm in the distance. Every building, every fence line, every watercourse. It's all been arranged for what's coming. The raiders think they're laying a siege, but they're really walking into a trap, 3 months in the making. As if to punctuate his words, the sound of hammering rang out from the direction of Morgan's farm. Sarah recognized it as the signal they'd arranged. Thorne's men had found the false water cache just as Morgan had planned. Tonight, Morgan said quietly, Deadeye Thorne's going to learn that sometimes the deadliest weapon isn't the fastest gun, but the most carefully laid plan. And his brother's going to learn that some ghosts don't just haunt the past, they rise up to protect the future. As darkness fell over Salvation Creek, the town held its breath, waiting for the storm to break. But unlike before, when fear had ruled their hearts, now they watched with the quiet confidence of people who knew they weren't standing alone. A quiet farmer with 2 graceful hands had shown them that sometimes the strongest defense isn't built with guns and barricades, but with patience, preparation, and the unshakable bonds of community. Sarah noticed something else about Morgan as the sun began to set, a subtle change in how he carried himself. The careful movements of the farmer were still there, but underneath them was something else, something that reminded her of a mountain lion coiling before a leap. You've been waiting for this, haven't you? She asked quietly, not just preparing the town, but preparing yourself. Morgan checked his supplies one final time before responding. 3 years ago, after Sonora, I made a choice. Decided that maybe the best way to fight men like the Thorns wasn't to hunt them down one by one, but to build something they couldn't break. Something that would teach others to stand against them. He turned to Tommy, who had been watching him with eager eyes. "Remember what I told you about snakes, son? That there are 2 ways to deal with them," Tommy repeated proudly. "You can hunt them, try to kill them one by one, or you can change the ground they slither on," Morgan finished. "Make it less welcoming to snakes, more supportive of honest folk trying to build something good." Sheriff Hayes had been checking his rifle nearby. "That's why you chose this valley, isn't it? Not just because it was next on their list, but because it was the right place to make your stand." Morgan nodded slowly. "Salvation Creek isn't just another target for the raiders. It's the keystone of their whole operation. Take this valley, they control water rights clear to the border. Lose it." His smile held that predator's edge again. "Lose it, and everything they've built starts to crumble." As darkness deepened, more details of Morgan's preparations became clear. The townspeople moved with quiet purpose, taking up positions he had carefully planned and rehearsed. Every building had been subtly modified, sight lines cleared, defensive positions strengthened, escape routes established. "But what about their superior numbers?" Sarah asked, worried despite her growing confidence in Morgan's planning. 30 against 1 town. "Numbers don't mean much when you don't know where to point your gun," Morgan replied. "Look there." He pointed to where the raiders' campfires were starting to glow south of town. "They've set up exactly where I wanted them to. Those clearings looked natural, but every one of them was carefully prepared. The ground's been worked to channel movement, the brush trimmed to create false cover." Tommy's eyes widened with understanding. "Like how you arrange the farm, all those precise measurements, the careful spacing." "Smart boy. Everything serves 2 purposes. A fence line can guide movement just as well as it can hold cattle. An irrigation ditch can hide a man or trap. One, depending on how you shape it." Morgan's voice held quiet pride in his student's perception. As the town made its final preparations, Seth Thorne's voice carried clearly from the raiders' camp, rising in anger. "I'm telling you, brother, this is wrong. That man, the way he moves, the way he set everything up, I've seen it before." "You're jumping at shadows," Deadeye's dismissive reply floated back. "One broken-down farmer and a town full of scared settlers. By this time tomorrow, they'll be begging to sell." Morgan's smile was ghost-quiet in the gathering dark. "Some men never learn," he murmured. "They think because they can't see the trap, it isn't there. By morning, they'll understand that sometimes the deadliest force isn't the fastest draw or the biggest gang. Sometimes it's the quiet man who's spent months preparing ground that looks like salvation but holds something else entirely." The night ahead would bring violence, there was no doubt about that, but it would also bring something else, a lesson about the true nature of power, and a demonstration of why some men are remembered not for the speed of their draw, but for the wisdom behind their trigger finger. And Daniel Morgan, the farmer with 2 graceful hands and 2 sharp eyes, was ready to teach that lesson to anyone who mistook patience for weakness. The moon rose over Salvation Creek like a watchful eye, casting silver shadows across Morgan's carefully prepared battlefield. The night wasn't silent. It never is in the desert. But there was a different quality to its sounds now. A tension that made every rustle of wind through sage seem like a whisper of warning. The first move came just past midnight. 3 of Thorne's men tried to slip into town from the east, following what appeared to be a natural path between 2 rocky outcrops. They moved with the confidence of experienced raiders, but they didn't understand that every step was taking them exactly where Morgan wanted them to go. Tommy, watching from his hidden position in the church bell tower, saw it happen. The raiders reached a particular point between the rocks, where Morgan had spent weeks adjusting the ground just so. One moment they were advancing confidently, the next they were scrambling for balance, as the seemingly solid ground shifted beneath their feet, sending them sliding into a carefully prepared ditch. The trap wasn't lethal. It didn't need to be. Instead, it left the men trapped in an awkward position, exposed to careful rifle fire from 3 different buildings. More importantly, it sent a message. They weren't dealing with helpless farmers anymore. "Hold your fire," Morgan's quiet voice carried to the defensive positions he'd established. Let them think about their situation for a minute. The raiders did exactly that, quickly realizing they had only 2 choices: retreat in embarrassment or call for help. They chose the latter, which was exactly what Morgan had anticipated. "Nicely done, son," Morgan said to Tommy as the boy reported back. "You kept watch exactly as we practiced. Now what do you think they'll do next?" Tommy's face scrunched in concentration. "Well, if I was them, I'd be awfully mad about being tricked. Might try to come in force, show how tough they are." Morgan's smile held approval. "Good thinking. And where would you attack from if you were angry and wanting to prove something?" "The west side," Tommy replied quickly. "It looks the weakest, and they'd want to show they're not afraid of coming right at us." "Smart boy, which is exactly why we prepared that side special." Morgan turned to Sheriff Hayes, who had joined them. "Think it's about time for that signal we discussed." Hayes nodded and fired 2 shots into the air, the predetermined signal for all townspeople to clear the western approaches. They'd barely finished moving when Deadeye Thorne's voice boomed out from the darkness. "That was a cute trick with the ditch," he called, his voice carrying easily in the night air. "But playtime's over. You got 1 hour to start signing over those water rights, or we're coming in to take them, and believe me, you won't like how we do that." Morgan's response was unexpected. He laughed. Not loudly, but the sound carried clearly enough for Thorne's men to hear. It was the kind of laugh that made hardened gunmen shift uncomfortably in their saddles. "Mr. Thorne," Morgan called back, his voice still carrying that farmer's gentle tone, "I've been meaning to ask, how are those poisoned springs working out for you?" There was a moment of confused silence before Seth Thorne's voice cut through the darkness. "Brother, something's wrong. The men who drank from our water supplies are getting sick." Another pause, then Deadeye's voice, now edged with rage. "What did you do? Me?" Morgan's reply was mild as ever. "I just planted some things upstream, Mexican nightshade mostly. Looks just like regular creek grass, but the water runs through its roots. Well, let's just say it can be mighty uncomfortable if you don't know which springs to drink from." The revelation sent a ripple of unease through the raiders' ranks. They'd come expecting to find helpless farmers, easy prey for their usual tactics. Instead, they'd found their own methods turned against them with a precision that spoke of careful planning. "You're going to pay for that," Deadeye snarled. "Nobody plays games with the Box Canyon Raiders." "Not playing games, Mr. Thorne. Just teaching a lesson about the difference between looking strong and being strong." Morgan's voice hardened slightly. "You've got your own hour to decide. Ride away now. Never come back, or learn exactly why. Your brother's hand shakes every time he thinks about Sonora." The threat hung in the air like gunsmoke. Sarah, watching from her store's upper window, saw how Seth Thorne's gloved hand moved unconsciously to his gun at Morgan's words, but it was Deadeye's reaction that worried her most. He'd gone deadly. Quiet. The kind of quiet that usually preceded explosive violence. She needn't have worried. Morgan had planned for this too. Just as Deadeye opened his mouth to reply, a series of explosions rocked the night, carefully prepared charges placed in the cliffs above the raiders' camp. They weren't meant to kill, just to rain down enough. Rocks and debris to create chaos and confusion. That's the thing about building an empire on fear. Morgan's voice cut through the commotion. Sooner or later, somebody teaches your men what real fear feels like. The raiders' camp dissolved into confusion. Horses spooked by the explosions broke free. Men scrambled for cover that wasn't there. And through it all, Morgan's careful preparations continued to unfold. Every escape route led to another trap. Every seemingly safe position exposed them to carefully placed defenders. "Time to move," Morgan said quietly to Hayes. "Get everyone to their secondary positions. They'll try to regroup, make a show of force to save face. When they do—" "The west side," Tommy interrupted excitedly. "Just like we figured." Morgan nodded approvingly. "Just like we figured. But first, they'll need to deal with what's about to happen at their camp." As if on cue, more chaos erupted from the raiders' position. The water barrels they'd brought with them, the ones they thought were safely secured, had somehow come loose, rolling through their camp and spilling their contents. In the darkness and confusion, men slipped and fell, horses panicked, and the carefully maintained image of the fearsome Box Canyon raiders began to crack. "Listen to me." Deadeye's voice rose above the chaos, trying to restore order. "This is one man's tricks. Are you going to let some farmer make fools of you?" "Not just one man," Morgan called back. "Look around you, Mr. Thorne. Every person in this town has helped prepare what you're experiencing. Every trap, every setback, every bit of confusion. It's all been created by the very people you thought would be easy prey." Sarah watched as Morgan moved through the darkness with that fluid grace she'd first noticed in her store. He wasn't rushing and wasn't showing any sign of concern. Instead, he moved like a man who knew exactly how every piece of his plan would fall into place. "You're forcing my hand," Deadeye shouted, real anger now coloring his voice. "Whatever reputation you had in Sonora, you're dealing with something else entirely now." "No, Mr. Thorne." Morgan's reply was softer now, but somehow more menacing for its gentleness. "You're the one dealing with something new. You're used to breaking things, spirits, lives, communities. But you never learned that sometimes the strongest thing isn't what can't be broken, but what grows stronger from the attempt." The night was about to show Deadeye Thorne and his raiders exactly what that meant. As Morgan's careful preparations continued to unfold, the true scope of his planning began to become clear. This wasn't just about defending a town. It was about teaching a lesson that would echo throughout the territory. In the chaos at the raiders' camp, Seth Thorne grabbed his brother's arm. "This is exactly how it started in Sonora," he hissed, his gloved hand trembling slightly. "The traps, the confusion, making us doubt every step. He's not just defending, he's hunting us." "You're letting old fears cloud your judgment," Deadeye snapped. But there was a new tension in his voice. "No one man could have prepared all this. That's what you're not understanding." Morgan's voice carried from somewhere in the darkness, though none of the raiders could pinpoint exactly where. "It's not one man you're fighting. It's every person in this town, every hand that helped lay these traps, every eye watching your movements. I just showed them how." Sarah, from her position upstairs in the store, saw one of Thorne's men try to take aim at where Morgan's voice had come from. Before he could fire, a single shot rang out, not from Morgan's position, but from old Mrs. Henderson at the church. The bullet kicked up dirt at the raider's feet, making him dance backward right into another of Morgan's prepared pitfalls. "You, see?" Morgan continued, as the man struggled to regain his footing. "Even our oldest widow knows exactly where to shoot to drive you where we want you. This isn't just about guns anymore, Mr. Thorne. It's about a community that's learned to think. Like one mind, move like one body." Tommy, still in his observation post, watched in fascination as Morgan's plans unfolded. Each time the raiders tried to regroup, they found themselves working against the very landscape. Paths that seemed to offer escape led to dead ends. Cover that appeared solid proved treacherous. Even the moonlight seemed to work against them, casting shadows exactly where Morgan had predicted they would. "Your brother's right about one thing," Morgan called out to Deadeye. "This is similar to Sonora, but there's a key difference. In Sonora, I was working alone. Here, He paused as another series of coordinated shots from the townspeople drove a group of raiders into yet another prepared trap. Here I've had 3 months to teach good people how to defend what's theirs, how to turn every inch of ground into an ally. Sheriff Hayes moved to where Morgan stood in the shadows of the church. They're getting desperate, he observed. Might try something reckless soon. Counting on it, Morgan replied quietly. Deadeye's got a reputation to maintain. He can't let his men keep looking foolish like this. He'll have to make a move to restore their confidence. His eyes glinted in the darkness, and when he does, as if on cue, Deadeye's voice roared through the night. Enough of these games. Boys, burn them out. Every building, every farm. Let's see how clever their tricks are when everything's ash. But Morgan had prepared for this too. As the raiders reached for their oil bottles and torches, they found another surprise waiting. The ground around their camp had been subtly prepared with a mixture of minerals and powders that Morgan had carefully scattered over the past weeks. The first attempt to light a torch resulted in a flash of green-blue fire that sent horses rearing. In panic, copper dust, Morgan explained to Tommy's wide-eyed look, mixed with a few other things, harmless in daylight but strike a match near it at night. Another flash illuminated the raiders' confusion. Makes for quite a show. Sarah couldn't help but marvel at the layers of Morgan's planning. You've thought of everything, haven't you? Had to, Morgan replied, checking his position as he spoke. Men like Thorne, they're used to people either fighting back directly or running away. Either way plays to their strengths. But this... He gestured at the continuing chaos in the raiders' camp. This makes them face something they don't understand. Makes them question every move, doubt every step. Through the confusion, Seth Thorne's voice rose in near panic. Brother, we have to pull back, regroup while we can. No! Deadeye's authority cracked like a whip. No more retreating, no more playing his game. Morgan! His voice rose to a roar. You want to end this? Face me, one-on-one, right now. Or are you only brave when you're playing your tricks in the dark? A hush fell over the night. Everyone, raiders and townspeople alike, held their breath, waiting for Morgan's response. Sarah felt her heart skip as she saw him step away from the church's shadow, his movements carrying that deadly grace she'd noticed the first day in her store. Are you sure about this? Hayes asked quietly. Morgan's smile was ghost quiet in the moonlight. Everything that's happened tonight has been leading to this moment, Sheriff. Sometimes the only way to truly end something is to meet it head-on. He raised his voice to carry to the raiders' position. All right, Mr. Thorne. Dawn's coming soon. Meet me on Main Street when the first light hits the church steeple. Bring your brother too. Might as well settle all old debts at once. The challenge hung in the air like smoke after gunfire. The night's chaos had served its purpose, showing the raiders that their usual tactics were useless against a well-prepared community. But now, as the stars began to fade in the eastern sky, everything would come down to what Morgan had been preparing for since the day he first arrived in Salvation Creek. The fastest gun in the West was about to show why speed alone is never enough against a man who knows how to turn patience into a weapon. And Deadeye Thorne was about to learn that sometimes the deadliest force isn't the man who draws first, but the one who's been planning the draw since before his opponent knew there would be a fight. The hours before dawn crept by with agonizing slowness in Salvation Creek. Morgan spent them methodically checking his preparations one final time, his movements carrying that same careful precision he'd shown while planting crops. But now there was something else in his manner, a coiled readiness that reminded Sarah of a mountain lion before the pounce. You don't have to do this, she told him, as he stopped by the store to check sightlines one last time. We've shown them they can't take the town by force. Maybe that's enough. Morgan shook his head slowly. Men like the Thornes, they don't learn from setbacks. They just get meaner, more desperate. This needs to end here, needs to become the kind of story that makes other raiders think twice before targeting peaceful folks. Tommy, who had refused to go to sleep despite his mother's insistence, watched Morgan with worried eyes. "But Mr. Morgan, they say Deadeye's never lost a fair fight, and his brother—" "Son," Morgan interrupted gently, "let me tell you something about fair fights. The time to win them isn't when you're standing in the street at dawn. It's in all the moments that lead up to that point. Every choice, every preparation, every detail you notice that your opponent doesn't." He knelt down to the boy's level, his voice taking on that teaching tone that had become familiar over the past months. "Remember how we set the fence posts on the east field? How particular I was about the spacing?" Tommy nodded eagerly. "You said every post had to be exactly 8 steps apart." "That's right. And how many steps is it from the store's front door to the center of the street?" The boy's eyes widened with understanding. 8 steps, just like the fence posts," Morgan smiled approvingly. "Everything we've done, every measurement, every position we've practiced, it's all been preparation for this morning. When Deadeye Thorn stands in that street, he'll think he's choosing his own ground, but he'll be standing exactly where 3 months of planning put him." Sheriff Hayes approached, his badge catching the first hints of pre-dawn light. "Raiders are getting restless," he reported. "Seth's been arguing with his brother for the past hour. Seems he remembers more about Sonora than he's been letting on." "He should," Morgan replied, checking his gun with practiced care. It was the first time most of them had seen him handle a weapon, and the way his hands moved with the revolver made it clear that his farming skills weren't the only ones he'd mastered. Seth made a mistake in Sonora, thought that being fast was the same as being ready, cost him 2 fingers and his reputation. Sarah watched him prepare with growing concern. "And his brother? What's Deadeye's mistake?" "Same one most men like him make, thinking that fear is stronger than community, thinking that because he can intimidate individuals, he can break a whole town's spirit." Morgan's smile held that predator's edge again. He's about to learn differently. As the first hints of color touched the eastern sky, Morgan gathered the townspeople for final instructions. Every position had been carefully planned, every angle considered, every possibility accounted for. But what struck Sarah most was how calm everyone seemed. 3 months of Morgan's quiet guidance had transformed them from frightened individuals into a coordinated force. "Remember," he told them, "no matter what happens in the street, stick to the plan. The Thorns aren't the only ones we're fighting today. Their whole gang needs to learn that this town isn't the easy target they thought." Old Man Jenkins, who'd been skeptical of Morgan's methods at first, spoke up from his position near the saloon. "You taught us well, Mr. Morgan. Ain't a person here who doesn't know exactly what to do if things go wrong." "Nothing's going to go wrong," Morgan replied with quiet confidence, "because everything that's about to happen has been happening since the day I arrived. The Thorns just haven't realized it yet." As he spoke, the first ray of sunlight struck the church steeple, setting the weathered cross ablaze with golden. A light, right on cue. Deadeye Thorn's voice carried across the morning air. "Time to end this, Morgan. No more tricks, no more traps. Just you and me, settling things the old way." Morgan checked his gun one final time, his movements smooth as silk. "Tommy," he said quietly, "remember what I taught you about watching people's hands?" "Yes, sir. You said a man's hands tell you what he's thinking before his face does." "Good boy. Watch Deadeye's hands when he walks out. They'll tell you everything you need to know about what he's planning." He turned to Sarah. "Ma'am, might be best if you kept Tommy inside now." But Sarah stood her ground. "He's learned from you these past months, Mr. Morgan. We all have. He deserves to see how the lesson ends." Morgan studied her for a moment, then nodded slightly. "Just stay clear of the windows. Deadeye's got a reputation for fancy shooting. Likes to show off by targeting reflections. He stepped out onto the street, his movements unhurried, precise as ever. The morning sun cast long shadows across the dusty ground, shadows that Morgan had measured and memorized over countless dawns. Every step he took was calculated, placing him exactly where 3 months of preparation said he needed to be. Deadeye emerged from the raider's position, his signature double gun belts gleaming. Seth followed slightly behind, his gloved hand flexing nervously. The brothers moved with the confidence of men used to having their way. But Sarah noticed something Morgan had taught them all to look for. The slight tension in their shoulders, the way their eyes darted around, searching for traps even here. "Last chance to back down," Deadeye called out, coming to a stop exactly where Morgan had predicted he would. "Sign over the water rights, and maybe we'll let your little town survive." Morgan's voice carried clearly in the morning air, still holding that farmer's gentle tone. "Interesting choice of words, Mr. Thorne. Let us survive. That's always been your mistake, thinking you have the power to let or not let people live their lives. I've got 30 men and more guns than this." "Town's ever seen," Deadeye snarled. "I'd say that's all the power I need." "Really?" Morgan's smile was ghost quiet. "Then why are your hands shaking?" The observation struck Deadeye like a physical blow. His hands were indeed trembling slightly, something none of his men had dared mention, but Morgan had spotted instantly. "You're used to being the fastest," Morgan continued, his voice carrying that teaching tone he used with Tommy. "Used to everyone being afraid of your reputation. But look around, Mr. Thorne. Look at this town you thought would be an easy target. What do you see?" Despite himself, Deadeye did look. He saw townspeople watching not with fear, but with calm purpose, saw how every position had been carefully prepared, every angle covered, saw how even now his men were subtly being herded into positions Morgan had chosen long ago. "I see a man who's about to learn why they call me Deadeye," he growled, but his voice lacked its usual certainty. Seth Thorne couldn't stay quiet any longer. "Brother, listen to him. This is exactly how it happened in Sonora. He talks, makes. You doubt yourself, gets in your head before the guns ever clear leather." "Shut up!" Deadeye snapped, but his eyes never left Morgan. "Your ghost stories about Sonora don't matter here. This is different." "Is it?" Morgan's voice remained calm, almost contemplative. "Tell me, Mr. Thorne, why do you wear those guns crossed like that? For show? Or because you're worried about someone being faster than a straight draw?" The question hit home. Deadeye's crossed gun belts had been his trademark for years, but now everyone could see the truth in Morgan's words. It was a setup designed to prevent anyone from getting the drop on him, a sign of fear masked as bravado. "Your brother understands," Morgan continued, still not moving toward his own gun. "He learned in Sonora that sometimes the fastest draw isn't the one that wins. Sometimes it's the man who knows where every shadow falls, where every footstep should land. The man who's been practicing the fight in his head long before the guns come out." Tommy, watching from beside his mother, noticed something extraordinary. Though Morgan appeared to be completely focused on the Thorne brothers, his feet were moving in an almost imperceptible pattern. 8 steps forward, 2 to the side, exactly like they'd practiced in the farm's east field. "He's doing it, Ma," Tommy whispered excitedly. "Just like with the fence posts," Sarah nodded, understanding dawning in her eyes. Every casual movement Morgan made was positioning him precisely where he wanted to be, using measurements and patterns he'd drilled into muscle memory over months of preparation. Deadeye saw none of this. His focus was entirely on Morgan's hands, waiting for the telltale twitch that would signal a draw. "Enough talk," he growled. "You've had fun with your tricks and traps. Now let's settle this like men." "Like men?" Morgan's voice took on an edge of steel beneath its gentle tone. "Tell me, was it manly when you shot Michael Mason in the hands before killing him? When you burned out families who wouldn't sell? When you poisoned wells and called it business? The question struck Deadeye like physical blows, each one carefully chosen to chip away at his composure. Sarah realized that even now, at the brink of violence, Morgan was still teaching, showing them all how a man's mind could be his greatest weapon or his worst enemy. "You don't know what you're talking about," Deadeye snarled. But he's right. And had begun to twitch slightly near his gun, "Don't I? Let me tell you exactly what I know." Morgan's voice carried across the street, pitched so everyone could hear. "I know you started small, just another bully with a fast gun and bigger dreams. But somewhere along the way, you realized that terror was more profitable than simple robbery. You learned that fear could make people give up everything they had, could break spirits so completely that no one would dare stand against you." Each word was precisely aimed, striking at the carefully constructed image Deadeye had built over years. The raider leader's face had gone pale with rage, but Morgan wasn't finished. "But here's what you never learned, Mr. Thorne. Fear only works when people believe they're alone, when they think no one will stand with them. Look around you now. Look at what you're really facing." Despite themselves, both Thorne brothers looked. They saw not just Morgan, but an entire town united. Every window, every doorway, every possible position held someone ready to act. But it was more than just numbers. There was a confidence in the townspeople's bearing that spoke of careful preparation and absolute trust in their plan. "Even now," Morgan continued, his voice almost gentle, "you're standing exactly where I've wanted you since the day I arrived. That shadow across your gun belt, I planted that tree last spring, knowing exactly how tall it would be by autumn, exactly how it would block the morning sun. Those loose boards beneath your feet, I helped. The carpenter replaced them 2 months ago and measured the space between them to match a man's stance." The revelation sent a visible shudder through Seth Thorne. He remembered Sonora, remembered how every seeming advantage had turned out to be carefully crafted by the man they'd thought was their prey. "Brother," Seth's voice shook slightly, "he's not just fast, he's been choreographing this whole thing from the start." Deadeye's composure finally cracked. "No more games," he roared, his hands twitching closer to his guns. "Draw or back down, but no more of your damn mind tricks." Morgan's smile was ghost quiet in the morning light. "Mr. Thorne, everything that's about to happen was decided long before you rode into Salvation Creek. The only question is whether you're smart enough to see it before it's too late." The tension in the street had reached a breaking point. Everyone could feel it. The moment when words would give way to action, when months of preparation would meet desperate speed in a test as old as the West itself. And through it all, Daniel. Morgan the farmer, with 2 graceful hands and 2 sharp eyes, continued his subtle dance of position and psychology, showing everyone present that sometimes the deadliest weapon a man can possess isn't his speed or his aim, but his ability to control every aspect of the confrontation before it even begins. Time seemed to slow in Salvation Creek's dusty street. The morning sun had climbed just high enough to paint long shadows across the ground, each one precisely where Morgan had known they would be. Deadeye Thorne stood rigid with barely contained rage, his crossed gun belts gleaming, while his brother, Seth, watched with the desperate attention of a man who'd seen this dance before and knew its deadly rhythm. "One last chance," Morgan said quietly, his farmer's voice carrying that edge of steel beneath its gentleness. "Ride away. Leave this territory. Find somewhere else to prey on those weaker than yourself." Deadeye's laugh was sharp as broken glass. "Or what? You'll kill us both? 30 of my men have guns trained on this street. Even if you're as fast as Seth claims, you can't stop them all." "Interesting assumption," Morgan replied, still not moving toward his holster. "That I'd need to stop them all. Tell me, Mr. Thorne, have you looked at your men lately? Really looked at them?" Despite himself, Deadeye glanced at his raiders. What he saw made his face darken further. His men weren't watching the street. They were watching Morgan, and in their eyes was something Deadeye had never seen before: doubt. "They've been listening," Morgan continued, his voice taking on that teaching tone he used with Tommy. All night long, they've watched their usual tactics fail, watched their reputation crumble against simple farmers and shopkeepers who refused to be afraid. And now they're wondering, if they were wrong about this town being easy prey, what else might they be wrong about? Seth's gloved hand flexed nervously on his gun. Brother, he's doing it again, getting in our heads, making us doubt. Shut up. Deadeye's composure cracked further. I don't care about your Sonora ghost stories. Draw, damn you, let's finish this. But Morgan wasn't finished teaching his lesson. Your men are thinking about Miguel Rodriguez, he said calmly, naming one, of the raiders who'd been trapped in his prepared ditches the night before. About how he called for help, but you were too busy trying to maintain your image to send anyone. They're remembering James Cooper, who you left behind in Promise Wells when things got hot. Each name struck like a physical blow, and Deadeye's men shifted uncomfortably at the truth in Morgan's words. He'd spent months learning everything about the raiders, not just their tactics, but their history, their internal conflicts, the small betrayals that created cracks in their loyalty. That's your real weakness, Morgan continued, not your speed. With a gun or your tactical thinking, though both could use work, it's that you never understood the difference between fear and loyalty. Fear only works until someone shows people they don't have to be afraid anymore. Sarah, watching from her position, saw what Morgan was doing. Even now, at the brink of violence, he was teaching, not just the townspeople, but Deadeye's own men. Each word was a carefully placed seed, just like the crops he'd tended so patiently. Tommy noticed something else. Ma, he whispered excitedly, look at Mr. Morgan's feet. Morgan was moving in that same subtle pattern they'd practiced so many times, 8 steps to position, 2 to adjust, each movement placing him exactly where he needed to be. The morning sun caught his shadow, throwing it precisely across Deadeye's gun belt, just as he'd planned months ago when planting that particular tree. Last warning, Morgan said softly, though I suspect you're too caught up in your own legend to take it. Pride's a dangerous thing, Mr. Thorne. Makes a man ignore what's right in front of him. Deadeye's control finally snapped. His hands dropped to his crossed gun belts, moving with the speed that had made him famous throughout the territory. But Morgan had been waiting for this moment since spring planting, and what happened next became instant legend in Salvation Creek. Before Deadeye's guns had cleared leather, Morgan's hand moved, not with the flashy speed of a showman, but with the precise efficiency of a man who understood that the fastest draw isn't always the one that wins. His movement was almost casual, like checking a fence post or testing soil. But it held a deadly grace that made Seth Thorne cry out in warning, too late. Deadeye's guns hadn't even finished their upward arc when Morgan's single shot rang out. The bullet struck with surgical precision, hitting exactly where Morgan had aimed, not to kill, but to disarm. Deadeye's primary gun went spinning away, while his second caught in his fancy crossed belts, tangling him up in his own trademark gear. Seth, seeing his brother's predicament, went for his own gun. But Morgan had planned for this too. His second shot came so fast it seemed to overlap with the first, striking Seth's gloved hand in almost exactly the same spot he'd hit it 3 years ago in Sonora. The leather glove went flying, revealing the mangled fingers beneath, a reminder of what happens when speed meets patience and loses. That's twice now, Morgan said quietly, his gun unwavering. Care to try for 3? The street fell silent, except for the soft moaning of the Thorne brothers. Deadeye was struggling with his tangled gun belt, while Seth cradled his twice-wounded hand, but Morgan wasn't finished teaching his lesson. "Sheriff," he called out, not taking his eyes off the Thornes, "might want to check the raiders now. See how many are still interested in dying for a man who just got outdrawn while wearing 2 guns. Hayes didn't need to look." The sound of horses moving out told its own story. Deadeye's men, having seen their invincible leader brought down by a supposedly simple farmer, were already melting away into the morning light. "You planned this?" Deadeye gasped, finally, freeing himself from his gun belts. "All of it. The whole damn thing was a setup from the start." "No, Mr. Thorne," Morgan replied, his voice gentle again. "You did this to yourself. Every step you took, every choice you made, was exactly what I expected from a man who thinks fear is stronger than community." He turned slightly, addressing the remaining raiders. "Any of you want to continue this dance?" The answer came in the form of more hoofbeats, as the last of Deadeye's men decided that discretion was the better part of valor. Within minutes, only, the Thorne brothers remained, surrounded by townspeople who had shed their fear like an old coat. Sarah stepped forward, her brother's spare badge glinting in her hand. "What now, Mr. Morgan?" "Now," Morgan said, finally holstering his gun with that same fluid grace, "we make sure the lesson sticks. Sheriff, I believe the territorial marshal in Promise Wells would be very interested in having a word with these gentlemen about certain unresolved matters." Hayes moved to secure the Thorne brothers, but Morgan wasn't done. He knelt down next to Deadeye, his voice pitched for the former raider leader's ears alone. "Remember this day," he said softly. "Remember how all your speed, all your reputation, all your fancy gun work meant nothing against a man who took the time to prepare properly. Remember how your empire of fear crumbled when faced with something stronger, a community that refused to be afraid." Deadeye looked up, real fear finally showing in his eyes. "Who are you? Really?" Morgan stood, brushing dust from his clothes with the same care he showed tending his crops. "Just a farmer," he said, loud enough for everyone to hear. "A man who learned that the fastest gun isn't nearly as powerful as the slowest seed. That patience, preparation, and community will always beat fear and violence, long as you're willing to take the time to grow something worthwhile." As the morning sun climbed higher over Salvation Creek, the townspeople began to understand the full scope of what they'd witnessed. This wasn't just a showdown between a farmer and a gunslinger. It was a lesson about the true nature of strength, about how a community working together could overcome any threat, about how the seeds of courage and preparation properly tended could bloom into something stronger than fear. Tommy, watching Morgan walk back toward his farm with those 2 graceful steps, finally understood what his mentor had been teaching all along. Sometimes the deadliest force isn't the fastest gun or the biggest gang, but the quiet man who knows how to turn patience into power and community into an unbreakable shield against fear. The days following the Thorne brothers' defeat brought changes to Salvation Creek that few could have predicted. Word spread through the territory like wildfire. Tales of how a quiet farmer had outmaneuvered the notorious Box Canyon raiders, how speed and intimidation had failed against patience and preparation. But the real story, the one that grew stronger, with each telling, wasn't about gunplay or violence. It was about how one man had taught an entire community to stand together against fear itself. Morgan returned to his farm the morning after the showdown, resuming his careful tending of crops, as if nothing extraordinary had happened. But Sarah Mason noticed something different in his movements now, a subtle relaxation, as if a weight he'd carried for years had finally been set down. "You never intended to just save one town, did you?" she asked, bringing him supplies from her store. "This was always about something bigger." Morgan looked up from where he was checking his wheat rows, those 2 sharp eyes softening slightly. "During the border wars," he said quietly, "I learned that a gunfighter's greatest skill isn't speed with a gun. It's understanding patterns, seeing how small changes can have large effects. I realized the same principle could be applied to fighting evil." He gestured at his carefully tended fields, where the morning sun painted everything in shades of promise. Sometimes the best way to stop violence isn't with more violence, but by teaching people how to make violence ineffective, by showing them that the strongest defense isn't a gun or a barricade, but a community that knows how to work together. Tommy, who had appointed himself Morgan's permanent student, absorbed every word. "Is that why you made the fence posts exactly 8 steps apart? Why do you measure everything so carefully?" Smart boy. Morgan's smile held genuine pride. Every measurement, every position, every detail. They weren't just for farming or for that one confrontation. They were lessons in how to read terrain, how to prepare ground, and how to think ahead, lessons that can be passed on, taught to others. The truth of his words became apparent as visitors began arriving in Salvation Creek. First came the curious, other towns, sheriffs and mayors, wanting to see for themselves how one small settlement had broken the back of the territory's most feared gang. But they were followed by others, farmers and shopkeepers from communities that faced their own threats, all eager to learn what Morgan had taught. Sheriff Hayes found himself hosting impromptu classes in the tactics Morgan had developed, showing other lawmen how to turn their town's natural features into defensive advantages. Sarah's store became a gathering place where people shared stories and strategies, learning that the strongest resistance to evil often grew from the simplest seeds of cooperation and preparation. Even some of Deadeye's former men returned, not seeking revenge, but redemption. They'd seen something in Salvation Creek that had changed them, a demonstration that there were stronger forces than fear, better ways to live than by intimidation and violence. "You know what impresses me most?" Old Man Jenkins said one evening, as the town gathered for a celebration. "Ain't just that you outfought the thorns, Mr. Morgan. It's how you did it, without turning us into what we were fighting against. We learned to defend ourselves without becoming hard or cruel." Morgan nodded, slowly. That's the real secret. The raiders' power came from making people afraid, making them close themselves off from each other. The antidote to that isn't just physical defense, it's building connections, creating something stronger than fear. Word of what happened in Salvation Creek spread beyond the territory. The territorial governor himself rode out to see what had changed in this once vulnerable town. What he found wasn't just a community that had learned to defend itself, but a model for how other settlements could stand against the lawlessness that plagued the frontier. "I could offer you a marshal's badge," the governor told Morgan privately. "God knows we need men like you wearing the law's star." But Morgan simply shook his head, that ghost of a smile playing around his lips. "With respect, Governor, I can do more good right here, growing things. Not just crops, but ideas about how people can protect themselves without becoming what they're fighting against." The governor looked around at the transformed town, at the carefully positioned buildings, the well-maintained defensive positions that doubled as community gathering places, the way people moved with quiet confidence instead of fear. "You've certainly grown something remarkable here." "The soil was good," Morgan replied, using the farmer's metaphors that had become his trademark. "These people just needed someone to show them how to tend it properly." As autumn painted the valley in shades of gold and crimson, Salvation Creek continued to transform. The old church, once a symbol of hope against harsh odds, became a school where Morgan taught not just reading and writing, but the principles of preparation and community defense that had saved the town. Tommy proved an especially apt pupil, absorbing not just the physical skills Morgan taught, but the deeper wisdom behind them. "It's like you said about the fence posts," the boy commented one day. "Everything serves two purposes, protection and growth." "That's right," Morgan agreed, watching as former raiders worked alongside townspeople to strengthen the community's defenses. The strongest barrier against evil isn't a wall or a gun, It's people working together, supporting each other, turning their differences into strengths. Sarah found Morgan on his porch one evening, watching the sunset paint the valley in familiar shades of promise. "Will they come back?" she asked quietly. "The Thorns, or others like them?" "Probably," Morgan admitted. "Evil has a way of trying to reclaim ground it's lost. But this valley's different now. These people are different." He gestured at the town, where lights were beginning to twinkle in the gathering dusk. "They've learned that the strongest defense isn't in how fast you can draw a gun, but in how deeply you've planted your roots in the community around you." The changes in Salvation Creek rippled outward like waves in a pond. Other towns began adopting Morgan's methods, learning that the best way to fight lawlessness wasn't just with badges and guns, but with carefully prepared communities that stood together against threat. The Box Canyon Raiders' defeat became more than just another frontier tale. It became a blueprint for how good people could stand against evil without losing their own goodness in the process. And through it all, Daniel Morgan continued his patient work, tending both his crops and the seeds of knowledge he'd planted in the community. His gun remained ready but rarely needed, a reminder that sometimes the most powerful weapon isn't the one that deals death, but the one that nurtures life. "You know what I finally understood?" Tommy asked one morning, helping Morgan check the fence posts that had played such a crucial role in the town's defense. "When you first came here, everyone thought you were just a farmer pretending to be a gunfighter. But really, you were a gunfighter learning to be something better." Morgan's smile held approval for his young student's insight. "The fastest gun can only solve one problem at a time," he said softly. "But an idea, a way of thinking that shows people how to stand together, how to prepare and support each other, that can solve problems for generations to come." As winter settled over Salvation Creek, bringing with it a peace that felt earned rather than borrowed, the legend of the farmer who outdrew the territory's fastest guns continued to grow. But those who had been there, who had watched Morgan's patient preparation unfold, knew the real story wasn't about speed with a gun or tactical brilliance. It was about how one man had shown an entire community that the strongest power isn't in the ability to deal death, but in the patience to nurture life and grow something worth protecting. The fence posts still stood exactly 8 steps apart, marking more than just property lines now. They stood as silent reminders that sometimes the deadliest force isn't the fastest draw or the biggest gang, but the quiet man who knows how to turn patience into power and community into an unbreakable shield against fear. And in that lesson, Salvation Creek had found not just safety, but a new way of living that would endure long after the tale of its defender had passed into legend. Winter came early to Salvation Creek that year, bringing with it whispers of trouble from the south. The Thorn brothers were safely in territorial custody, but nature abhors a vacuum, and other predators had taken notice of how one small town had brought down an empire. Among them was Jackson Blackjack Hawthorne, a man who'd made his fortune in the California goldfields through means that made even the Box Canyon Raiders look gentle. Word reached Morgan one bitter morning as he was checking his winter wheat. Sheriff Hayes, still adjusting to the weight of his expanded duties, rode up with news that made the veteran gunfighter's eyes narrow. "Hawthorne's men have been asking questions in Copper Canyon," Hayes reported, his breath frosting in the cold. About you specifically, about what really happened here." Morgan continued his inspection, though Sarah, watching from her store porch, noticed how his movements had changed, become more measured, more precise. The farmer was fading, the gunfighter emerging once again. "Interesting timing," Morgan mused, studying a wheat sprout with careful attention, just as the mountain passes are about to close with snow. "That's not all," Hayes hesitated, then pressed on. They say he's bringing something new, Gatling guns, 3 of them. This got Morgan's full attention. The rapid-fire weapons could change everything, making his carefully prepared defensive positions worthless. But there was something in his eyes, not fear, but the calm calculation that had served him so well before. "You know what most men don't understand about machines like that, Marcus?" Morgan asked, examining another wheat sprout. With careful attention, they think more bullets mean more power, but a Gatling gun is just like any other weapon. It's only as good as its position, its timing, and the man using it. Sarah approached, her face tight with worry. "Even you can't outshoot a Gatling gun, Thomas." "No," Morgan agreed, "but I don't have to. Sometimes the best way to defeat a weapon isn't to fight it, but to make it useless." He turned to Hayes. "Ride up to the old mission ruins behind the burnt chapel. You'll find a cache of supplies I laid in months ago. Bring back the brass spyglass and the mining maps." As Hayes rode off, Sarah confronted Morgan directly. "You knew something like this would happen, didn't you? Even after the Thorne brothers, you kept preparing." Morgan's smile held no humor. "Peace is like farming, Miss Sarah. You don't just plant once and expect crops forever. You have to tend it, protect it, and be ready for the storms that come." He looked south toward the mountain passes. "Hawthorne's not like the Thorns. He doesn't want to own the valley. He wants to destroy it, make an example of what happens to those who resist men like him." That evening, Morgan called a town meeting in the church. The community that gathered was different from the frightened settlers of 6 months ago. These were people who had stood against terror and won, who had learned that courage, like fear, could spread if given fertile ground. "Hawthorne's coming," Morgan announced simply, "and he's coming for blood. Those Gatling guns can tear this town apart. Then we stand again," Old Man Jenkins declared, his voice firm. "You showed us how last time." But Morgan, standing quietly at the back of the church, shook his head. "Not like last time. This needs to be different. Hawthorne's expecting a gunfighter's tricks, expecting me to try to pick off his men from hiding." His eyes held that distant look that meant he was seeing things others couldn't. "So we give him something else entirely." Tommy, who had grown, both in stature and understanding under Morgan's tutelage, was the first to catch on. "You're not building barriers," he realized, watching Morgan sight along a timberline. "You're building something else." "Hawthorne thinks he knows what he's facing," Morgan replied quietly. "Thinks he's learned from the Thorns' mistakes. But there's an old saying among gunfighters, the target you see isn't always the target that matters." As the first snow began to fall, Salvation Creek prepared for war once again. But this time, under Morgan's guidance, they were preparing for a very different kind of fight. The Desert Ghost had one more lesson to teach about the nature of patience, preparation, and the true meaning of strength. Sarah Cooper found him at dawn, checking measurements with the brass spyglass Hayes had retrieved. The instrument wasn't a military issue. It was something else, something more precise. Like everything about Morgan, it had a purpose beyond the obvious. "That's not just for spotting, is it?" she asked, offering him coffee. Morgan adjusted the spyglass settings with practiced care. "It's a surveyor's transit. Spent 2 years with the railroad, learning how to map terrain, calculate grades and angles." He smiled slightly. "Useful skills. For a gunfighter, even more useful for what's coming. And what exactly is coming?" The question came from Hayes, approaching through the knee-deep snow. "Because right now all I see is a lot of timber and stone placed where it won't stop a single bullet from those Gatling guns." "That's because they're not meant to stop bullets." Morgan's voice held that quiet certainty that had come to mean trouble for his enemies. "They're meant to direct them. Every frame, every stone pile, they're like the banks of a river, channeling water where you want it to go." Understanding dawned in Hayes's eyes. "You're creating killing grounds." "No." Morgan's denial was sharp. "I'm creating choice points, places where Hawthorne and his men will have to make decisions. And in weather like this, with limited visibility," he gestured at the swirling snow, "they'll make the choices I want them to make." The day brought more preparations, but not the kind anyone expected. Instead of digging defensive positions, Morgan had the townspeople spread hay and straw in specific places, creating paths that looked like natural routes through the snow. Each path led past his wooden constructions, past piles of stone that seemed randomly placed. Tommy, watching from his favorite observation point, began to see the pattern. "It's like a maze," he said excitedly, "but one you can't see until you're in it." "Smart boy," Morgan nodded approvingly. "In a snowstorm, men follow the path of least resistance. They'll take what looks like natural cover, move along the easiest routes. And those routes lead right where you want them," Tommy finished. "But what about the Gatling guns?" Sarah asked, joining them. Morgan's smile held a predator's edge. "A Gatling gun is just a complicated way of throwing lead. And like anything complicated, it has weaknesses. Weight, limited mobility in deep snow, fixed firing positions." He pointed to the heavy clouds gathering over the mountains. "But its biggest weakness? Visibility. A Gatling gun is useless if you can't see what you're shooting at." That afternoon, Hawthorne's scouts were spotted checking the passes. They were careful, professional, but they saw exactly what Morgan wanted them to see. A town preparing typical defenses, seemingly aware of the devastating power of rapid fire. Weapons. Sarah found Morgan that evening in his barn, methodically checking his Colt, but he was also preparing something else. Small metal canisters with carefully measured fuses. "Mining charges?" she asked, surprised. "Sometimes," Morgan replied, working the action of his revolver with practiced smoothness. "The best trap isn't the one you set, but the one your enemy sets for himself. Every man has patterns, habits. Hawthorne's known for using Gatling guns to pin down his targets while his men move in for the kill. He'll expect us to hunker down, try to weather the storm of bullets. But that's not your plan." Morgan held up one of the metal canisters, studying it in the lamplight. "A gunfighter's greatest asset isn't his speed. It's his ability to control the battlefield, to shape it, to know every angle, every distance, every choice his opponent will face." As night fell, more news arrived. Hawthorne's main force was moving through the passes, using the storm for cover. They had the Gatling guns hauled on specially designed sleds, but they also had something else, something that made Morgan's eyes narrow when he heard about it. "Explosive shells," Tommy reported breathlessly. "For the Gatling guns. They're saying Hawthorne plans to make an example of Salvation Creek, not just defeat us, destroy us completely." Morgan absorbed this information with his usual calm, but those who knew him saw the subtle changes, the way he checked his gear with extra care, the stillness that came over him, not the stillness of fear, but of a predator preparing to strike. "Good," he said finally, surprising everyone. "Let them bring their explosives. Sometimes the best weapon is the one your enemy brings to the fight." That night, as the storm intensified, Morgan gathered the town's defenders in the church. The plan he laid out was unlike anything they expected. No heroic last stands, no dramatic gunfights from distant ridges. Instead, he spoke of timing, of pressure points, of how fear and limited visibility could turn a superior force's strength against itself. Tomorrow, he concluded, Hawthorne will learn what the Thorns learned, that Salvation Creek isn't just land worth fighting for, it's land worth thinking for, ground worth planning for, and most importantly, his eyes met each defender in turn. It's home to people worth protecting by any means necessary. As the defenders dispersed to their positions, Sarah caught Morgan's arm. "You're not telling us everything, are you? There's more to your plan." There always is, Miss Sarah. Morgan checked the chambers of his Colt one final time. But sometimes, the best plan is the one your own people can't reveal even under pressure. The night deepened, the storm howling like a pack of wolves scenting blood. Somewhere in that swirling white darkness, Hawthorne's forces were moving into position, confident in their superior firepower and explosive arsenal. But they were moving into a battlefield shaped by a master of angles and distances, a man who had spent months preparing for this moment. Morgan moved through the town's defenses like a ghost, checking positions, adjusting sightlines, ensuring every piece of his elaborate plan was in place. But it was more than just physical preparation. He was setting the stage for a psychological battle as well. "Remember," he told Tommy, who insisted on helping despite his mother's concerns, "Hawthorne's men aren't just fighting us. They're fighting their own fears, their own doubts. In this weather, every shadow becomes a threat. Every unexpected sound makes them question themselves." "Like how you handled the thorns," Tommy said excitedly. "Getting in their heads before the actual fight." Morgan's smile held approval for his student's insight. "But this is different. Hawthorne's smarter than the thorns, more calculating. He'll be looking for mind games, expecting them, so instead, we give him something else entirely, Tommy," he finished. "Something he won't expect because he's too busy looking for tricks. Smart boy." In this weather, with visibility near zero, even Gatling guns become more of a liability than an asset. They'll be so focused on protecting their precious weapons, they won't see the real trap until they're already in it. As dawn approached, Morgan made one final round of the town's defenses. Every position had been carefully prepared, every angle considered, every possibility accounted for. But more importantly, every defender understood their role not just in the physical battle to come, but in the psychological one. "Remember," he told them, "Hawthorne's men are used to being the ones who cause fear. They've never had to face their own. In this storm, with their visibility gone, their superior weapons more hindrance than help, they'll start to understand what real fear feels like." Sarah watched him make his preparations with growing understanding. This wasn't just about defending against Gatling guns or explosive shells. This was about turning an enemy's strength into a weakness, about making their confidence work against them. "You're not just preparing for a battle," she realized. "You're preparing to teach another lesson." Morgan nodded slowly. "The most important one yet. Because after today, every gunman and would-be tyrant in the territory will learn that sometimes the most dangerous force isn't the man with the most guns or the fastest draw. Sometimes it's the quiet farmer who's spent months preparing ground that looks like salvation, but holds something else entirely." As the storm raged on, Morgan's careful preparations continued to unfold. The true scope of his planning was about to become clear, and Hawthorne was about to learn why some legends are best left undisturbed. The next part of our story would reveal just how deep Morgan's planning went, and how one man's patient genius could turn even the most powerful weapons against those who wielded them. Dawn never really came to Salvation Creek that morning. The storm had intensified overnight, turning the world into a swirling chaos of white that reduced visibility to mere yards. Perfect weather for an attack, most would say. But Morgan had been counting on exactly this kind of day. The first sign of Hawthorne's advance came as a deep rumbling through the frozen ground, the sound of heavy sleds carrying the Gatling guns through the blinding snow. Dark figures emerged from the white void, moving exactly as Morgan had predicted, following the paths of least resistance that he'd so carefully prepared. "Right on schedule," Morgan murmured from his position near the church steeple. He wasn't. Using the spyglass in this weather, eyes alone worked better. Besides, he'd memorized every distance, every angle months ago. "Tommy, signal the south ridge." Young Hawkins raised a lantern 3 times, its light diffused by the snow into a ghostly glow. Moments later, an answering flash came from where Old Man Jenkins and his men waited. Everything was in position. The first Gatling gun team struggled through the snow, following what appeared to be a natural path between 2 rocky outcrops. They moved with professional precision, but their confidence was their weakness. They never thought to question why this particular route seemed easier than the others. "Watch closely," Morgan told Tommy, who had insisted on staying by his side. "What do you see about their formation?" Tommy studied the approaching forces with the careful attention his mentor had taught him. They're spreading out, trying to protect the guns. Good. And why is that a mistake?" "Because," Tommy's eyes lit up with understanding, "they're splitting their strength, just like you said they would." Morgan nodded approvingly. "In weather like this, men naturally seek what looks like the safest path, the best cover. They don't realize they're being guided, like water flowing into channels we've prepared." The first part of Morgan's plan revealed itself as Hawthorne's men positioned their prized Gatling guns. Each team found what seemed to be perfect firing positions, slight rises offering clear fields of fire toward the town, or what seemed like clear fields. "Now," Morgan said quietly, a series of carefully placed charges detonated, not where the Gatling guns stood, but in the snow-covered slopes above them. The explosions weren't meant to kill, just to start a carefully calculated cascade of snow and debris. The Gatling gun teams found themselves trapped, not by violence, but by Morgan's intimate knowledge of how snow and terrain could work together. "You've turned the storm itself into a weapon," Sarah realized, watching from nearby. "Nature's always the best ally," Morgan replied. "Those guns need solid ground and clear sightlines to be effective. Take those away." His point was proven. As the first Gatling gun team tried to reposition their weapon, the snow-covered ground, which Morgan had spent months preparing with carefully hidden ditches and subtle grades, turned treacherous under the heavy weapon's weight. The gun began to slide, its crew scrambling to control it. Hawthorne's voice boomed out from the white void, carrying rage and frustration. "Hold your positions! Don't let them spook you with a few tricks." But Morgan's preparations were far more than tricks. The paths that seemed to offer escape or better position only led deeper into his carefully prepared maze. The storm, which should have hidden Hawthorne's advance, instead became a wall that separated his forces, each group finding themselves isolated and uncertain. "Time for the second phase," Morgan said quietly. "Sheriff?" Hayes raised his rifle and fired 3 quick shots into the air. The signal set off a chain reaction throughout the town's defenses. Lanterns flared to life in seemingly random patterns, their light diffused by the snow to create ghostly shapes that seemed to move through the storm. The effect was disorienting, making it impossible for Hawthorne's men to distinguish real threats from shadows. "Your men are blind, Mr. Hawthorne." Morgan's voice carried through the storm, seeming to come from everywhere and nowhere. "Those Gatling guns you're so proud of? Might as well be wagon wheels in this weather, but we can see just fine. Want to know why?" The question was answered by another series of coordinated movements from the defenders. Each person knew exactly where to be, how to move, using patterns they'd practiced for months. In the swirling snow, it seemed like the town was defended by an army, rather than a few dozen determined citizens. "Because we know this ground," Morgan continued, his voice still carrying that deadly calm. "Know every inch, every angle, every shadow. Been preparing it since before you ever thought of moving north. Those paths your men are following, I laid them out during spring planting. Those solid-looking positions where you've placed your guns, I prepared them in summer." A burst of Gatling gunfire split the air, the bullets vanishing uselessly into the storm. The sound echoed strangely off Morgan's carefully positioned structures, making it impossible to tell where the shots had come from or where they had gone. "Keep firing," Hawthorne commanded. "Sweep the whole town if you have to." "That's right." Morgan's voice held a grim satisfaction. "Waste your ammunition. In this weather, with the snow playing tricks on your eyes, you're just as likely to hit your own men as any of us. Speaking of which, how many of your men do you still have, Mr. Hawthorne?" The question struck home. In the chaos of the storm and Morgan's carefully planned confusion, Hawthorne's forces had become scattered. Some had followed what seemed like promising paths, only to find themselves isolated. Others had sought better positions, only to become separated from their companions. "What's happening?" Tommy whispered, watching the confusion unfold. "The same thing that happened with the Thorns," Morgan explained. "Men like Hawthorne, they're used to their strength being in their weapons, their numbers. Take away their ability to use that strength effectively." A crash echoed through the storm as one of the Gatling guns, its crew blinded by snow and desperate to find better position, slid into a prepared ditch. The sound was followed by curses and the growing realization among Hawthorne's men that they were fighting an enemy they couldn't see, on ground that seemed to work against them with every step. "Listen to me," Hawthorne's voice held an edge of desperation now. "Morgan, you want to face me? Come out and fight like a man." "Fighting like a man," Morgan replied, his voice carrying clearly through the storm, "isn't about standing in the open and trading shots. It's about protecting what matters, using every advantage, every scrap of knowledge to defend good people against men like you." As if to emphasize his point, more of Morgan's preparations revealed themselves. The explosive shells Hawthorne had brought, meant to destroy the town, proved worse than useless in the storm. The blasts, when they came, were absorbed by Morgan's carefully prepared earthworks or deflected by positioned timber frames, their sound echoing back to further disorient the attackers. "You see, Mr. Hawthorne," Morgan continued, "while you were thinking about destruction, I was thinking about protection. While you were counting your guns, I was measuring angles. While you were planning an attack, I was preparing ground that would turn your own strength against you." Sarah, watching from her position, saw the true genius of Morgan's strategy. He hadn't just prepared the town's defenses. He had transformed the entire valley into a weapon, using Hawthorne's own tactical assumptions against him. The storm, which should have been the attacker's ally, had become their enemy. The superior weapons, which should have guaranteed victory, had become a burden. "Time to end this," Morgan said quietly. "Tommy, give the signal." The boy raised the lantern one final time, and the defenders moved into their last prepared positions. What followed would become legend in the territory, not for its violence, but for how it demonstrated that sometimes the greatest victory comes not from overpowering an enemy, but from making their power meaningless. Through the swirling snow, Morgan's careful planning continued to unfold. Each defender moved with practiced precision, using prearranged signals and positions that made their small number seem like an army. The lantern signals, reflected and distorted by the storm, created the illusion of movement where there was none, while hiding real movements behind carefully timed distractions. "Fascinating thing about snow," Morgan explained to Tommy as they watched another Gatling gun crew struggle with their increasingly useless weapon. "It doesn't just blind men, it changes how they think, makes them doubt what they see, what they know. And when men start doubting, they make mistakes," Tommy finished eagerly. "Smart boy. Watch their hands. See how they keep brushing snow from their guns? Those Gatling guns need to be kept dry to work properly. In this weather, they're fighting the storm as much as they're fighting us." Hawthorne's voice carried again through the white void, but now there was something different in his tone, a hint of uncertainty that hadn't been there before. "Morgan, these games end now. We've got your town surrounded." "Do you?" Morgan's reply seemed to come from everywhere at once, thanks to the carefully positioned structures that reflected sound in ways he had calculated months ago. "Are you sure?" About that, Mr. Hawthorne, because from where I stand, it looks like your men are the ones who are surrounded. To demonstrate his point, another series of controlled avalanches cut off what Hawthorne's men thought were safe retreat routes. The snow, which had been carefully managed and prepared over the past weeks, now served as both barrier and weapon. Sarah watched in amazement as Morgan's strategy revealed itself layer by layer. "You're not just using the storm," she realized. "Here you've been preparing for it since summer, haven't you?" Morgan nodded, checking his position with practiced care. "Every drainage ditch we dug, every berm we built for the crops, they were all designed to channel snow when winter came. The paths your boy Tommy helped me clear through the high grass, they're now perfect routes for controlled avalanches." "But how could you be sure it would snow today?" Morgan's smile held that predator's edge. "I didn't need to be sure. I just needed to be ready. Weather's like people, Miss Sarah. Give it the right conditions, and it'll do exactly what you expect it to do." A burst of Gatling gunfire interrupted their conversation, the bullets whining uselessly through the storm. But this time, something was different. The rapid-fire weapon's characteristic roar sounded strained, mechanical. "There it is," Morgan said with satisfaction. "Snow's getting into the mechanisms. Won't be long now before they seize up completely." As if to prove his point, the Gatling gun's fire stuttered and died, followed by curses and the sound of men trying desperately to clear their frozen weapon. "Your fancy guns aren't working so well now, are they, Mr. Hawthorne?" Morgan called. "Out. Might want to count your men too while you're at it. Sure seems like there are fewer voices out there than there were an hour ago." He was right. Throughout the morning, members of Hawthorne's force had been quietly slipping away, demoralized by the combination of useless weapons, disorienting conditions, and the growing certainty that they were facing something they didn't understand. "They're not just leaving because they're scared," Morgan explained to Tommy. "They're leaving because they've lost faith in their leader. Men like Hawthorne maintain control through fear and the promise of easy victory. Take those away." Another crash echoed through the storm as the second Gatling gun, its crew trying desperately to find better position, succumbed to Morgan's carefully prepared ground. The sound seemed to break something in Hawthorne's remaining men. "Boss!" a voice called out in near panic. "The guns are freezing up! We can't—" "Shut up!" Hawthorne's authority cracked like a whip, but there was fear in it now. "Morgan! You would think you're clever using this storm against us when it clears." "When will it clears?" Morgan's voice held almost gentle amusement. "Mr. Hawthorne, what makes you think I'm going to wait for the storm to clear? Look around you, really look. Every path you thought would lead to victory has turned into a trap. Every advantage you thought you had has become a burden. And now, on cue, the defenders began their final movements. Lanterns flared in careful sequence, creating the illusion of forces moving through the storm. The sounds of boots on wooden planks, carefully positioned to amplify and echo, suggested men moving to surround the attackers. "What's happening?" Tommy whispered, watching the carefully choreographed deception unfold. "We're showing them what they've been afraid of all along," Morgan replied. "Not just defeat, but helplessness. The same helplessness they've made others feel with their guns and their threats. Through the swirling snow, they could hear Hawthorne's remaining men arguing among themselves. The confidence that had marked their arrival was gone, replaced by confusion and growing fear. "Remember what I told you about patterns?" Morgan asked Tommy. "About how men like Hawthorne think?" "Yes, sir. You said they're so used to being the ones causing fear that they don't know how to handle being afraid themselves." "That's right. And right now, they're experiencing something they've never faced before. The complete failure of everything they believe makes them strong. Their guns won't work, their numbers don't matter. Even their leader's reputation can't help them." Sarah watched as more of Hawthorne's men began to retreat, not in any organized way, but in ones and twos, slipping away into the storm. "They're breaking," she observed. "No, Morgan corrected gently. They broke the moment they realized they weren't fighting just one man or even one town. They're fighting every natural force we've turned against them, every preparation we've made, and their own growing fear of what else we might have planned. Now Hawthorne's voice held real desperation. "Stand and fight, you cowards. He's just one man." "That's where you're wrong, Mr. Hawthorne." Morgan's reply cut through the storm like a knife. "I'm not just one man. I'm every person in this town who helped prepare this ground. Every hour we spent measuring distances, calculating angles, learning how to use this valley's natural strengths. And right now, I'm your worst nightmare. A man who spent months making sure that everything you think makes you powerful is about to become the instrument of your defeat." The storm raged on, but within its swirling heart, Blackjack Hawthorne was about to learn the final lesson Morgan had prepared to teach, that sometimes the most complete defeat doesn't come from bullets or blood, but from the gradual, inexorable revelation that all your strength has been turned against you by a quiet farmer who knew exactly how to make power itself powerless. The storm reached its peak as Hawthorne's defeat became inevitable. His men were scattering, the Gatling guns rendered useless by snow and Morgan's careful preparations. But like a wounded predator, Hawthorne himself became more dangerous in his desperation. "Enough of this," his voice carried through the storm, edged with a rage that made even his remaining men flinch. "Morgan, face me, or are you only brave when you're hiding behind your tricks and traps?" Morgan's response was characteristically measured. "Interesting choice of words, Mr. Hawthorne. Hiding. Tell me, is a farmer hiding when he prepares his fields months before harvest? Is a man hiding when he uses every advantage to protect his home and people? You're no farmer," Hawthorne spat. "I know who you are now, the desert ghost, the man who never misses, never shows himself until it's too late. Well, I'm not leaving until one of us is dead." Sarah caught Morgan's arm as he moved to step out into the street. "Thomas, don't. You don't have to prove anything to him." Morgan's smile was gentle, but his eyes held that deadly focus she'd first noticed months ago. "Not proving anything, Miss Sarah. Just finishing what we started. Sometimes a man has to stand in the open to show others why they shouldn't." He turned to Tommy, who watched with worried eyes. "Remember what I taught you about the fence posts, about measuring distances?" "Yes, sir. 8 steps between each post, just like the distance from the store to the street." "Good boy. Now watch carefully. Everything that's about to happen was planned the day I set those posts. Every step, every angle, every shadow, they're all part of the dance." Morgan moved into the street with that fluid grace that had nothing to do with farming. The storm seemed to part around him, creating a small, clear space in its heart. Snow swirled at the edges of visibility, but between Morgan and where Hawthorne stood, the air was eerily still. "Here I am, Mr. Hawthorne," Morgan called, his voice carrying that same calm it had held while teaching Tommy about crops and distances. "No tricks, no traps, just you and me, and whatever skills we bring to this moment." Hawthorne emerged from the storm like a dark spectre, his long black coat dusted with snow. He carried matched Remington revolvers, their nickel finish gleaming dully in the diffused light. His reputation with those guns had made him feared throughout California, but now there was something desperate in how tightly he gripped them. "You've cost me everything," Hawthorne snarled. "My men, my guns, my reputation." "No," Morgan corrected gently. "You did that yourself. Every choice you made, every time you chose fear over respect, force over wisdom, they all led you here, to this street, this moment, this lesson. Still teaching even now." Hawthorne's laugh was bitter as the winter wind. "What's the lesson this time, Ghost?" "The same one I've been teaching since I arrived, that sometimes the deadliest force isn't the fastest gun or the biggest army. Sometimes it's the quiet man who takes the time to understand his ground, to prepare it properly, to know exactly where he needs to stand when the crucial moment comes." As if to demonstrate, Morgan took 3 precise steps to his left. To most observers, it would have seemed random, but Tommy, watching from the store's doorway, recognized the movement. It was exactly like their fence post drills, positioning Morgan where months of practice said he needed to be. "You're standing in the exact spot you planned, aren't you?" Hawthorne's eyes narrowed. "Been practicing this moment since you first arrived." "Every morning," Morgan agreed, "while tending crops, checking fences, teaching a boy about measuring distances. Every movement, every angle, every shadow, they're all old friends now." "Doesn't matter." Hawthorne's hands tightened on his revolvers. "I've got 2 guns for you, and a reputation that says I know how to use them." "Reputations," Morgan's voice held almost gentle amusement. "Tell me, Mr. Hawthorne, have you ever wondered why they called me the Desert Ghost? It wasn't for killing men. It was for appearing exactly where I needed to be, exactly when I needed to be there. For understanding that the fastest draw isn't about speed. It's about knowing the moment before it arrives." The tension in the street built like lightning about to strike. Sarah held Tommy close, but she noticed how the boy watched everything with keen attention, learning even now from his mentor's every move and word. "This is what you wanted, isn't it?" Hawthorne's voice shook slightly. "To face me in the open, prove who's faster." "No, Mr. Hawthorne, this is about showing everyone watching that there's more to strength than speed or firepower. That patience, preparation, and purpose will always beat raw power." Morgan's hand still hadn't moved toward his gun. "You're standing exactly where I knew you would be, thinking exactly what I knew you'd think, about to do exactly what I've spent months preparing for." "Enough talk." Hawthorne's patience finally snapped. His hands moved with the speed that had made him famous, both Remingtons seeming to leap from their holsters, but Morgan's movement when it came was something else entirely. It wasn't the flashy speed of a gunfighter showing off. It was the precise, efficient motion of a man who had practiced this exact moment thousands of times, who knew every angle, every shadow, every breath of wind. His single shot came so fast, it seemed to merge with the crack of Hawthorne's revolvers. But while Hawthorne's bullets vanished harmlessly into the storm, Morgan's found its mark with surgical precision. Both of Hawthorne's guns went flying, his hands stripped of weapons without drawing blood. "Impossible," Hawthorne gasped, staring at his empty hands. "Nobody's that fast." "Not about speed," Morgan replied quietly, his gun still trained with rock-steady aim. "About knowing exactly where everything needs to be. The angle of the sun, the direction of the wind, the precise distance between us. I've been practicing this moment every morning for 3 months." He gestured with his free hand at the street around them. "Every measurement, every position, every detail of this town, they're all part of a plan that's been unfolding since the day I arrived. Your Gatling guns failed because I prepared the ground to make them useless. Your men scattered because I showed them their strength was an illusion. And you're standing there now, disarmed and defeated, because I knew exactly where you'd choose to make your stand." The remaining raiders, watching from whatever cover they could find, began to emerge slowly, throwing down their weapons. They had seen something that shook them more deeply than any display of force could have. The complete and methodical dismantling of everything they believed made them powerful. "What now?" Hawthorne asked, his voice hollow. "Going to kill me like all the others?" "Others?" Morgan's smile held no humor. "I've never killed a man, Mr. Hawthorne. Never needed to, because the strongest weapon isn't the one that takes life. It's the one that changes how men think about using power." He turned to address the watching raiders directly. "Look around. You look at what happened here today. Your guns failed, not because they were outfought, but because they were made useless by preparation and understanding. Your strength became your weakness because someone took the time to learn how to turn it against you. Tommy, unable to contain himself, burst out. "Just like the fence posts, Mr. Morgan. Every measurement, every angle, all practiced until they were perfect." Morgan's smile softened as he looked at his young student. "That's right, son. Because the most important lesson isn't about guns or fighting. It's about understanding that true strength comes from patience, preparation, and the wisdom to know that sometimes the best victory isn't the one that destroys your enemy. It's the one that makes him question everything he thought he knew about power." As the storm began to ease, revealing the full extent of Morgan's preparations to the astounded raiders, a new legend was born in the territory. Not just of a farmer who outfought the most dangerous gang in the West, but of a man who showed that sometimes the deadliest force isn't the fastest gun or the biggest army. It's the quiet wisdom that knows how to make strength itself surrender to patience and preparation. Spring came early to Salvation Creek that year, bringing with it changes that few could have predicted. The story of how a quiet farmer had defeated Blackjack Hawthorne's gang spread through the territory like wildfire, growing with each telling. But unlike most frontier tales that focused on speed and violence, this one spoke of patience, preparation, and the power of a community standing together. Morgan returned to his fields the day after Hawthorne's defeat, resuming his careful tending of crops as if nothing extraordinary had happened. But Sarah Mason noticed something different in his movements now, a lightness, as if a burden he'd carried for years had finally been set down. "You're not going to disappear on us, are you?" she asked, bringing him supplies from her store. Now that the danger's past, Morgan looked up from where he was planning his spring planting, those two sharp eyes softening slightly. "The desert ghost might have been a wanderer, Miss Sarah, but Daniel Morgan's put down roots here. Some things once planted need tending to grow strong." Tommy, who had appointed himself Morgan's permanent apprentice, was already laying out, measuring lines for the new season's crops. "8 steps apart, Mr. Morgan," he called out. "Just like always?" "That's right, son. Though maybe this time we're measuring just for farming, not fighting." But even as he spoke, Morgan was teaching. New lessons. Riders had begun arriving in Salvation Creek, lawmen, community leaders, and yes, even reformed outlaws, all wanting to learn how one small town had defeated the most sophisticated gang in the territory. "Show me exactly where you place those." "Avalanche triggers," a sheriff from a neighboring county requested, studying Morgan's carefully prepared terrain. "Better if I show you how to read your own ground," Morgan replied. "Every town, every piece of land has its own strengths. The trick isn't copying what we did here. It's understanding how to use what you already have." The lessons went beyond mere tactics. Morgan taught them how to build communities that could stand together against threats, how to turn natural features into advantages, how to make violence itself less appealing than cooperation. His farm became a different kind of school, where people learn not just about defense, but about the deeper principles that had transformed Salvation Creek. "You've started something bigger than just protecting one town, haven't you?" Sarah observed one evening, watching Morgan teach a group of visitors about using terrain and weather to their advantage. "Every seed planted grows beyond its original boundaries, Miss Sarah," Morgan replied, using the farmer's metaphors that had become his trademark. "What we did here, what we built, it's like a healthy crop. It spreads, takes root in new soil, grows into something bigger than what was first planted." Even some of Hawthorne's former men returned, not seeking revenge, but redemption. They'd seen something in Salvation Creek that had changed them. A demonstration that there were stronger forces than fear, better ways to live than by intimidation and violence. "You know what's remarkable?" Old Man Jenkins said during a town meeting. "We're stronger now than we were before all this started. Not just in how we defend ourselves, but in how we work together, how we think about community." Morgan nodded slowly. "That's the real victory. Not defeating Hawthorne, but building something that makes men like him think twice about using force." Something that shows there's more power in working together than in trying to dominate through fear. The territorial governor himself rode out to see what had changed in this once vulnerable town. What he found wasn't just a community that had learned to defend itself, but a model for how other settlements could stand against the lawlessness that plagued the frontier. "I could offer you a marshal's badge," the governor told Morgan privately. "Lord knows we need men who can teach these lessons to other communities." But Morgan simply shook his head, that ghost of a smile playing around his lips. "With respect, Governor, I can do more good right here growing things. Not just crops, but ideas about how people can protect themselves without becoming what they're fighting against." The governor looked around at the transformed town, at the carefully positioned buildings, the well-maintained defensive positions that doubled as community gathering places, the way people moved with quiet confidence instead of fear. "You've certainly grown something remarkable here." "The soil was good," Morgan replied. "These people just needed someone to show them how to tend it properly." As summer approached, Salvation Creek continued to transform. The old church, once a symbol of hope against harsh odds, became a school where Morgan taught not just reading and writing, but the principles of preparation and community defense that had saved the town. Tommy proved an especially apt pupil, absorbing not just the physical skills Morgan taught, but the deeper wisdom behind them. "It's like you said about the fence posts," the boy commented one day. "Everything serves two purposes, protection and growth." "That's right," Morgan agreed, watching as former raiders worked alongside townspeople to strengthen the community's defenses. The strongest barrier against evil isn't a wall or a gun. It's people working together, supporting each other, turning their differences into strengths. Word of what happened in Salvation Creek spread beyond the territory. Other communities began adopting Morgan's methods, learning that the best way to fight lawlessness wasn't just with badges and guns, but with carefully prepared communities that stood together against threats. The defeat of Hawthorne's gang became more than just another frontier tale. It became a blueprint for how good people could stand against evil without losing their own goodness in the process. "You know what I finally understood?" Tommy asked, one morning, helping Morgan plan the fall planting. "When you first came here, everyone thought you were a farmer pretending to be a gunfighter. But really, you were a gunfighter learning to be something better." Morgan's smile held approval for his young student's insight. "The fastest gun can only solve one problem at a time," he said softly. "But an idea, a way of thinking that shows people how to stand together, how to prepare and support each other, that can solve problems for generations to come." Sarah found him on his porch that evening, watching the sunset paint the valley in familiar shades of promise. "Will they come back?" she asked quietly. "Others like Hawthorne or the Thorns?" "Probably," Morgan admitted. "Evil has a way of trying to reclaim ground it's lost. But this valley's different now. These people are different." He gestured at the town where lights were beginning to twinkle in the gathering dusk. "They've learned that the strongest defense isn't in how fast you can draw a gun, but in how deeply you've planted your roots in the community around you." As night settled over Salvation Creek, bringing with it a peace that felt earned rather than borrowed, the legend of the farmer who outdrew the territory's fastest guns continued to grow. But those who had been there, who had watched Morgan's patient preparation unfold, knew the real story wasn't about speed with a gun or tactical brilliance. It was about how one man had shown an entire community that the strongest power isn't in the ability to deal death, but in the patience to nurture life and grow something worth protecting. The fence posts still stood exactly 8 steps apart, marking more than just property lines now. They stood as silent reminders that sometimes the deadliest force isn't the fastest draw or the biggest gang, but the quiet man who knows how to turn patience into power and community into an unbreakable shield against fear. And in that lesson, Salvation Creek had found not just safety, but a new way of living that would endure long after the tale of its defender had passed into legend. Up next, you've got two more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hits the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.